So good morning, everyone. My name's Cat Hines. My pronouns are she, her. Up until the end of last week, I was diversity lead for the Bank of England. I've moved into a new role in the bank still as people strategy partner. Lucky enough, I still got to come to this conference and facilitate this panel today, despite the job move. Happy International Women's Day. The insights from yesterday, I think, proved why we still need to celebrate and recognise International Women's Day. And as we work through today, we won't just be talking about gender, we'll be touching on lots of other demographics where there is still lots of work to do. I'm joined by a fantastic set of colleagues this morning. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I'm all for delegation. But before I do that, I'll just flag that unfortunately our colleague Nieves from the Banco de España was unwell this morning, so she's not been able to join us. But there will be the opportunity to hear from the Banco de España in the next panel, so there will still be that chance, which is great as our hosts. So as I asked the panel to introduce themselves, I've asked them to also share some of the challenges that they're facing in their organisations, in particular in addressing unconscious bias and cultural assumptions in talent acquisition and promotion, and how those challenges impact the attraction and engagement of diverse talent. So I'll start with Micheal at the end, if that's okay.
Great, thank you, Kat, and thanks for that introduction. Happy International Women's Day to everyone as well. My name is Micheal O'Leary. I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Manager in the Central Bank of Ireland, and on the point that Vice Governor Delgado made around the role of men on International Women's Day, it is something that we hear all the time in our own organisation, that the role of men is absolutely essential and crucial. So not to be dismissed, to say that everyone in the room has a responsibility on that front. Look, I'm delighted to join the panel, and in particular the world of talent attraction and retention is something that is very close to our heart in all of our D&I activity in the Central Bank of Ireland. In terms of challenge, to try and pick up the baton for that one, the challenge I suppose we have is connecting with hearts and minds of people that are looking to join the Central Bank of Ireland. We have a particular image that sometimes doesn't lend itself to attracting the most diverse talent at all times. And I think we heard really good input yesterday, in particular from our keynote speaker, Ghazala, in the morning, around the aspiration and effort aspects of bringing people into an organisation, promoting them, recognising them. And I think that early stage attraction and recruitment stage is really all about showing that your aspiration can be fulfilled when you come and join us, regardless of what your diversity profile is and where you're joining from. And part of our central bank vision is to be a fulfilling workplace for all of our people. And part of our D&I vision is that we want to reflect the society in which we operate. And I think those two things match together very well, but they do speak very clearly to that idea of aspiration in the first case. Does somebody look at the Central Bank of Ireland and say, yes, I aspire to work there, I will fulfil my work, my career ambitions and needs, and do I see people like me there as well, which we might come on to with some of the solutions, but they're probably some of the high level stuff, Kat. So.
Good morning. My name is Sheila Clark. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer for the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., and the Federal Reserve System, which is comprised of not only the board, but also 12 reserve banks that are throughout the country. So we have a connection in which we all work together for equal employment opportunity, which is primarily, I think all of us have various laws that address that. But all of this over the years has evolved to where now we speak to diversity, we speak to equity, and we speak to inclusion. And so around all of those three individual elements, there are a lot of challenges, but there also are some successes as we have begun to address them in different ways because they are applicable to people in different ways depending on where they are in the organization. I think similar to my colleagues, we all are addressing the issues of people feeling like they belong within the organization, that they contribute to the success of the organization and the mission that we all have, which is to serve the country and the people who live within that country in a fair and equitable way. And we are the central bank, so we also have the mission of making sure that all our policies and things that we do are applicable to everyone. As I stated, we do, I hate to say it, but there are many challenges. But we were asked to identify one. We don't have enough time to talk about all of them. So the challenge that I've identified is around engagement. And so one of the high priority objectives for the Federal Reserve Board is really addressing the implications of equity as it relates to employee engagement. Not only equity, but also the relationship to inclusion as well. And because of the fact that we now are in a work environment that is so different, I think, from what we've known based on, unfortunately, COVID, we really are having to retool our leaders. We also are having to retool our employees as well in the sense of what their level of expectations are. So that is a high priority objective for us, is how to do that and how to be able to establish a culture that recognizes that this is an extreme need.
Gracias por la invitación. Je suis ravie d'être ici. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. Good morning. I'm Meghan Brooks. I'm the Director of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion at the Bank of Canada. And I'd want to start actually in a similar way to my colleagues here to say how proud I am to be here with an all-women cohort from the Bank of Canada. Shout out to our two fabulous researchers, Angelica and Shulin, senior leaders who joined us, Tamara from the executive team, Sermon from our Economic and Finance Research Department, our head of HR, our senior deputy governor. So I think that shows what a commitment the Bank of Canada has made, how important it is to us. And there are challenges in every organization. I think we've had a chance to share some of those successes and some of those challenges as we've been able to connect one-on-one at the conference, which has been a great opportunity for us. I'm going to focus in a little bit more on the promotion side of things, but of course, we're also thinking about attracting and recruiting, and we're thinking about engaging and having, a culture where people belong and are included in a meaningful way. But I guess when it comes to the promotion side, if you are human, you are biased, right? And so our job is not to be unbiased. Our job is to recognize our biases and to take steps to mitigate them. And so for us when we're thinking about promotion, we're thinking about the way that bias can be really subtle and it's unconscious. And so the challenge will always be to bring a lens of rigor and intentionality so that there's no space or there's little space for bias to impact outcomes. And so for us in particular, when we're thinking about those outcomes, we're thinking at the individual level, are these impacting the careers, the aspirations, the careers of and the outcomes of employees at the bank? But also we're thinking about how it affects the organization, right? And the bias, in that sense, could make it that we're not really creating opportunities and leveraging the diverse talents of our workforce. And when people aren't feeling that they have those opportunities, that it's bias and barrier free, they're less likely to give that extra effort. They're not going to feel like they belong. They're more likely to leave, and they're less likely to recommend us as an employer, which makes it hard to attract great, diverse talent. So those are the things that we're going to be tackling, and some of the examples I'll share today is really around how we've tried to bring intentionality to the conversation so that we can mitigate bias.
Great, thank you all. And I think there's a really good overview of how DEI is just there throughout the whole employee life cycle as well, and how important it is at all stages. So now that we've got an understanding of the challenges that we're facing, I'm going to ask you each to share examples of how your institutions have successfully addressed bias, or are trying to and working towards it. And that's bias, both conscious and unconscious, and cultural assumptions in talent management practices. And then what specific strategies or initiatives have been particularly effective for you in promoting DEI. So I will start with Sheila, if that's okay.
Thank you, Cat. I think we've been doing this for, I guess, as long as the institution has been in existence, which is over 100 and some odd years. I've worked with the Federal Reserve System for about 28 years, but this isn't my first job. I'm sure you know that. But But I have been involved in the whole space of people for a very long time. At the Federal Reserve, we primarily have a separation between HR and D&I, and that's intentional. We do support each other, and our actions have to be aligned with each other in order to be successful. The way we've done numerous amounts of things, but one of the things that we have done, which has been very helpful, is the fact is to be intentional is to establish a strategic plan around the area of D&I. And in that plan, what we have done is we've identified 4 primary areas in which we intend to establish strategies and actions. So one of our standards around diversity, equity, and inclusion is leadership engagement. You have to have the leaders engaged in this process in trying to address the issues. The other is talent acquisition, attracting people to the organization. Once they're there, helping and supporting them to reach their aspirations. There's a full conversation about that yesterday. The other is development. The fact is that we don't all come with everything. And so we have basically identified those areas in which individuals are able to develop themselves, establish developmental plans, and then we support those plans overall. And then we also address the area of equity. And I think equity relates to bias to a very large degree. So we tend to talk about conscious and unconscious bias. There really are, there's conscious bias too, and there are unconscious bias elements as well. And so how do we address that overall? So we do have leadership development. We've identified through our engagement surveys, we have engagement surveys where we receive feedback. We have open-ended questions that asks our employees, tell us what it is that you feel that you need your manager to do in order for you, one, to be successful in your job, to achieve your aspirations, and then also to address the barriers that you feel exist for you not being able to do that. So we have established what we call lunchtime discussions. Now, lunchtime discussions today are you're in your house having your lunch and you're on a screen through Zoom and other elements, but we're still engaged. That's a critical aspect. And the other things that we do, we also have what we call division, which are each function within the Federal Reserve Board has a scorecard. They have a D&I scorecard where they have to, in the beginning of every year, they establish their objectives against the 4 standards that I just spoke to. They establish their objectives and they identify what they're going to do against those objectives. So they have actions very specifically. The way our diversity office is designed, every business function has a liaison that is in the D&I office. And that liaison works with that business unit to help recommend, support, assess how they are moving toward achievement of their objectives. And that enables us to see what's working, what's not working, make recommendations. Do you need more managerial training? Do you need mentoring for your staff? Do you need advocates for those who have aspirations that require them to have an advocate to be able to be mentioned when they're not there? And so we assess those activities of each of our business units. We also do, I think similar to my colleagues, we have dashboards where we meet with each of our business units on a quarterly basis to show and have discussions around what's happening from a hiring perspective, what's happening from a promotion perspective, what's happening also with exits. One of the things I would tell you about the Federal Reserve is that people, they stay a long time. And so you have to also take that into effect because you have new entrees. So we all know that we have a lot of different, generations in the organization. And so we have to deal with them sometimes in different ways because the level of expectations are different. But one of the things, by quarterly having those discussions, we're able to get the business units to see where they need to work more effectively around, whether it's development, whether it's around trying to address issues of bias within the organization. And employees do let us know what complaints they have around not being treated equally, or not being, if they're being harassed, they feel they're being harassed, where bias comes into play around promotions. So 3 things we've been able to, in our last engagement survey. Employees indicated, 1, they need to know what's expected of them. 2, they need to understand what is the criteria to be promoted within their divisions. And the other is respect. And that all relates to the inclusion element as well as being treated equitably. And then also belonging. It all has to fit together. So we are addressing each of those components with our business units and making sure that the actions that they identify are aligned with the feedback that we're currently getting.
So, like I said, I'm going to focus a little bit more on promotion, but I love hearing, and I know we're doing some of the similar things and you're doing some different things. And so the hardest part of being on a panel like this is that you have to only pick a few things to talk about, when there's so much that you're excited about and proud of in your organization. And so I'm going to start, I have 5 things I'm going to cover. I'm going to start with a little bit of context just to situate the Bank of Canada where we're at, go into 3 initiatives related to promotion that also include an angle of development as well. And I'm going to close with sharing an initiative we have that's on the training front. So I guess to kick things off, I would say we also have a really strong foundation for EDI at the Bank of Canada. It's certainly something that is made possible through really strong partnerships. Our EDI team sits within HR, but it's working very closely with all departments and their leadership teams, including the executive as well. And it's founded in a few key strategic documents. And so we do have an equity, diversity, inclusion strategy, and it's intimately linked to our strategic plan. And this reflects the importance in the organization and shares that this is not just kind of a people strategy, it is an organizational strategy. We also have within the team, within HR at the bank, we have an accessibility plan, and we're going to be launching this year a reconciliation action plan, which is of particular significance in Canada around building and rebuilding relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. So that's a kind of strategic context. And in our EDI strategy, we have 4 big areas where we have initiatives. And the first one's around inclusive leadership. And so, of course, this is critical to the conversations today about bias, about eliminating barriers. And in there, you'll hear in the concrete examples that I have how we're supporting leaders and to be more inclusive. We also have an area around diversifying our workforce, reflecting the Canadians that we serve or who we serve. And we use labor market data to make sure that we're doing that. And I have a whole piece on data that I can't wait to get to because I know there's so many people in here who love data. We also, have a commitment to having an engaging workforce, and that includes, things like learning and opportunities to connect with employee resource groups as well, conscious inclusion training, among others. And we also have a 4th area, which is a newer area for us, which is thinking through how we apply an EDI lens to kind of quote unquote the core work of the bank. And so some of the presentations yesterday were really resonating with me in the sense of thinking through, and certainly the closing remarks of Olivier Grenier, which were who are we impacting with our decisions, and bringing that lens is critical in maintaining trust and delivering the best work that we can for our constituencies. So when it comes to the 3 initiatives I want to talk about, I'm going to start off with succession planning. So for us, succession planning, we've really made it formal and structured. And we do that because the less structured things are, the less rigor they have, the more opportunity there is for bias to creep in. And so we mean formal and structured in 3 different ways. So when it comes to succession planning at the highest levels of the organization, there's a lot of rigor around identifying talent and using assessments to do that. We also have calibration meetings where these are organized conversations or planful conversations around talent, and they're supported by HR. So our business partners go in with departments and leadership teams and support those conversations to ensure that there's balance in those conversations, that they're moving well, and that they're effective. We also have planning for development as well. So these are kind of tailored approaches that we can take to ensure that and that's an equity lens, right? That we're bringing to that so people have what they need. And so mapping out those processes has been very important to us. And we've had a lot of support in doing that. It's the philosophy behind the work, the planfulness, the intentionality, but there's also accountability behind it. And so these committees, these departments, these committees who are talking about talent are accountable to our senior leadership at the bank. One thing I'd highlight, and I'll go into more data later, but we did set in 2020 goals to increase the representation of women and those who identify as racialized in our senior officer pool. So think about that's like the top 90 people in our organization is our senior officer pool. And so the work in succession planning is critical to achieving our goals to better reflect the labor market. And so where we may not be reaching goals, where we find gaps in our succession planning, there is accountability all the way up to the board level in terms of having those conversations and adapting along the way where it's needed. I'm really happy to say, I was looking at some of the data that I wanted to pull today, and I'm really happy and proud to share that, with the efforts of many of the women in here from the bank, we've gone from 3 years ago, gone from 29% women at the senior officer level to 36%, from 9% racialized to 17%, and that's in 3 years. And so you'll see initiative like this has had incredibly positive outcomes. But they also needs to be backed with initiatives that aren't just at the senior level. We also have a really successful sponsored high potential program. So we call it a HYPO program. And this is for that next level of leadership in our organization. And that's a 2-year program that we designed in-house to really meet the needs of our organization. And there's 3 big pieces to that program that we have. There's executive sponsorship, there's targeted development, and then there's custom training for each individual. So on the sponsorship front, every executive team member sponsors a diverse high potential employee in that program. So they include them in meetings and events. So there's an exposure element to it, but there's also a championing of these people to help them get access into conversations and networks they didn't have before. And we all know how important role models and sponsors and mentors are, and we heard some of that yesterday. So for example, our senior deputy governor, has brought someone in to help develop speech and to go and deliver speeches, right? And so this is exposure that they might not have had before. So, it's great to see how this plays out, in the organization. The targeted on-the-job development piece is really around, it's really centered around the support of a coach. And then customized initiatives. So this is, shadow presentations to the board, for example. So watching how someone does it and then getting the opportunity yourself, getting access to projects that are perhaps more cross-functional than you might have had in your current role. So it's really kind of looking at that individual and giving them opportunities. And finally, the custom training pieces, could include things like executive presence training. It could also be around leading former peers, right? Because as people are developing, they're now in different positions, engaging with those with whom they've worked for a while in different ways, as well as an executive program as well. So that's the high potential piece. And then we scale it back even more to our general standardized talent management approach. And this is an approach that really is complementary to these other higher level programs that we have. And so certainly we want them to reinforce the goals and set us up to reach the goals that we have or the objectives of those programs. And certainly one of the goals we're trying to do is increase diversity in our pipeline so that it's moving through all levels, and we'll continue to diversify our senior team. And so having these pools and looking at the composition to ensure that it's not just kind of people at the lower end of the pipeline, but that they're being developed and that they're ready now when these opportunities come up. That's been one of the key successes of our HYPO program is to have that diverse talent ready to go when those opportunities are free. So those are kind of the 3 big talent pieces there. The training that we've recently developed and delivered to our senior leaders at the bank is a training on or a workshop on addressing bias in talent management. And it's a workshop because we get them in there and they're doing work. They're working through, issues and challenges. So it talks about the different kinds of biases, but also really concretely how they show up in talent management, right? So we talk about, we look for people who are like us, who have taken the same path for us, or the words that we're using to describe people. And so we really give concrete examples there, and they work through examples. And so we focus on three big activities. One is about objective setting and development. So certainly about this aspiration piece, right? And having the opportunities. If you're not getting the opportunities to develop, you're going to be more limited in your growth in an organization and reaching your goals. Identifying talent and succession planning. I talked about some of the rigor in that program, but we reinforce that and put it into practice. And then finally, when it comes to assessing performance, we all know examples of gendered language, for example, when we talk about, how women are performing, versus men performance. So these are some of the conversations that we're having using real life examples at the bank. So I'm going to wrap up there in terms of things that we're working on.
Okay, thank you. Micheal?
Thanks, Kat. One of the benefits of coming to our events like this is that I end up taking copious notes. I hadn't planned on doing it up at the top table this morning, but there's some really great stuff there of practical things that I think anyone in the room listening could be doing. And I think the logic and the structure really plays into what best practice looks like. So I'll just give the endorsement to my colleagues on the panel for that. For us, when we go back to that idea of how do we attract and recruit the diversity and the talent that we want into the organisation. For me, the challenge is kind of addressed it's partly a challenge of process. So do we have a fair and equitable process? There's partly a challenge of branding. So are we attracting the right people into that process? But there's this kind of intangible element then of how people feel throughout the process. So when they see your organisation's name, do they actually engage with it, or do they feel that isn't a place for me? And I think that's probably the hardest bit to get at. It's a little bit like the equivalent internally of the diversity is the easier bit, and I use that term very loosely, the easier bit. But the inclusion is the bit that we struggle with the most, I think, in every organisation. So that idea of the branding, first of all, I suppose we've taken a few kind of very obvious steps that you look at our website, you will see our branding over the last probably 18 months or so has improved to bring more diversity into what we look like, what we're saying, and how we engage with talent, prospective talent. One of the most impactful things was a very small initiative that we did. We literally just interviewed a diverse range of people from across the organisation and put those videos on our website. There was a kind of a heavy lift at the start in terms of learning how to produce a video and so on, but ably supported within the organisation for that. But it is incredible the amount of references that we get to those videos at interview stage, candidate stage, even when you're having to reject somebody at an offer stage. And they always actually, it's a real shame because I saw your videos and it looks like a place that I would love to work. And I would see a place for myself in that environment. So they're branding doesn't have to be the big splashy kind of over the top side of things. It can actually be something really deep and meaningful, and actually hearing from the voices in the organisation is something that we found really impactful. And has helped us to broaden and diversify that talent pool and do it in an authentic way. We're not making up stories, we're literally just putting people out there to tell their own story. The other aspect that we've done in terms of attraction is that we've tried to broaden our kind of our talent pool generally through and this kind of the profiles of diversity we're talking about here are maybe the socioeconomic and accessibility side of things by partnering with a lot of third level institutions, but also some representative organizations to really get a better diversity of people coming to the organization and applying. And some of that takes place within our local community. Some of it takes place at that third level university kind of a recruitment angle. And then, as I mentioned, we have a big focus on disability and accessibility at the moment. And again, we found a lot of traction there with, take a simple example like graduate recruitment, where going to a lecture hall like this and assuming that you're going to get all the diversity of people in a room to come and listen to your presentation about working at the Central Bank of Ireland. What we found is that going directly to the underrepresented groups and giving them a closed shop opportunity to learn about the central bank and speaking directly to their needs, whether that's their socioeconomic background, whether that's their disability requirements and accommodations, makes a huge difference in engaging with the diversity of talent, because the kind of broad stroke approach doesn't get to those niche areas that we really want to get more in touch with. From a process point of view, the job advertisements, the job wording, we've completely neutralised in a lot of cases like you mentioned, Meghan, the gendered language that was very pervasive, I would say, if you were to go back 10 years or 5 years in what a role profile at the Central Bank of Ireland looked like. But we've also tried to simplify and reduce the kind of the barriers to entry, whether that's an education requirement or whether that's an experience requirement that kind of auto-excludes people from applying, or they self-exclude because they think they don't meet a minimum bar. Now, there's always certain roles in the organisation that have a minimum bar. There is a qualification that you need, and we're kind of at the whim of society in some cases in that sense. But there are things that we had in our advertising and our role profiles, in our spec, in our interview process, that were just not necessary for us to get the best people. And I think that goes back to that point around getting what we really want to do is get the best people and the most out of those people. And the trade-off for them then is that we give them the fulfilling workplace that they can actually achieve their potential and their career ambitions. From a recruitment process point of view, we have very standardized recruitment process, which helps in the sense of managing some of that unconscious bias that is there. And I'm all over the idea of we're all biased in our certain ways, and it's about being aware of it. And it's also about realizing that doing the unconscious bias training for interview skills doesn't fix you. You come out of you complete the 30-minute webinar and you go to the 90-minute follow-up in person. You're not ready to interview in an unconscious bias manner, but it's about being aware of those unconscious biases and putting in place kind of the safeguards along the way, whether that's a balanced interview panel, whether that's blind shortlisting or leading to balanced shortlisting at the end. And I think that again leads to, hopefully better outcomes. And the idea of another kind of underlying principle we have in this area and in D&I generally is that we don't overly focus on the outcome that we're trying to achieve, whether that's gender representation, whether that's gender pay gap or disability representation, whatever it might be. What we try and do, and this is hard to hold ourselves to account all the time on, we try and ensure that we're doing the right thing. And whether that leads to perfect outcomes tomorrow or whether it takes a much longer time period, I think that's something we can stand over much more authentically and legitimately, and should sustain us over time in a more realistic fashion. So things like a gender pay gap is always one that comes up in our world, that we could fix that overnight. We have a very small gender pay gap as it is, but we believe we're doing the right things around attracting, recruiting, promoting and developing talent that will lead to a natural equity across the organisation when it comes to gender. The final area I'll touch on there, just for that kind of attraction, recruitment, development side of things, is that we do have a focus on training our leaders. So we have an inclusive leadership module on our senior leadership programs. We have a lot of we have a mandatory e-learning that everyone completes on an annual basis that includes things like unconscious bias and kind of behaviours in the workplace as well, which lead to that feeling of inclusion as well. I think Cat is going to come back in, but the final one that we do have is around mentorship and sponsorship. So we have a formal mentoring program that we've layered in additional D&I elements over the last 2 years. And again, we're asking more of people in return. So whether that's a leader or manager, we don't really distinguish between the person that can lead and lead us to be a more inclusive environment every day. That is everyone's responsibility in some form. So that kind of mentorship and sponsorship side of things is really important as well, because that's the day-to-day nitty-gritty that people need. And without that, the process falls down. Without the process, the day-to-day stuff falls down as well. So. Yeah.
Thank you all. Lots of really great work going on, so it's really great to hear. I have had the nod that we're supposed to be moving to question time, but our next question was on data and measurement, and I'm really keen that we do have the opportunity to hear from the panel on that, because it is such an important part of what we do. And actually, we took inspiration from the Federal Reserve Board back in 2019 and borrowed their idea of scorecards because of how powerful they are, and implemented them at the Bank of England. So I will do my best to leave time for questions, but I would like to just put the question to the panel and ask Meg to lead off on this around how you are measuring the effectiveness of your initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Central banks have a lot of data-loving people. And I don't know if it surprises you or not, but we love data in EDI too. We love it in HR and we love it in EDI. And so there's a lot of thought and rigor that goes into the data analysis that we do, especially at the Bank of Canada. So who's at the bank? We look at representation. I'm going to keep it really brief. we're legislated to know about women, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and those who identify as racialized. We also, as a priority for our organization, look at Francophones because we're a bilingual country, and we also look at those who are LGBTQ2S+. We use labor market data to make sure we're reflecting Canadians, and where we're not, we set goals. But it's not just who's there overall. We start to dig in to see, on our economics and finance side, are there particular gaps? Are there gaps on our administration side? And so we start to look at department levels. We look at the level of function. We look at leadership and non-leadership. And so there are these filters around who is at the bank and where are they in the bank. When it comes to, so that's the one piece, but it's how are they doing? That's the equity piece. Is there fairness in the outcomes of the organization? Are groups getting their share of all of the great things around employee talent? And so I'll zoom in really quickly to the piece around promotion, but we're looking at what we call mobility. So for us, mobility includes 3 different types of actions: promotions, laterals, and also development opportunities like temporary assignments. And so we look for those 6 groups I mentioned. We look at the different profile, like what share of each of those types are people getting. And so what we might see is overall we have really good mobility for women, but in one department they may be getting a little bit less of a share of promotions but more laterals. In another it might look a bit differently. And so we work with those leadership teams in those departments to kind of figure out, is it a process thing, is it a bias thing? And we've had really great success in departments increasing representation where they may have had gaps. We look at, again, for all of those 6 groups, we're looking at performance evaluations. So who's getting what ratings? Is there a fair distribution? What about salary outcomes? We're also looking at that, looking at, pay, bonus, overtime gaps, just like many organizations, and we're legislated as well to do that. Who's leaving and why? So again, we look at the groups and we see, are they leaving at a share that's higher than their representation? So then we know whether that, with that benchmark, if it's an equitable share of departures, and if it and to take action where we need to as well. We also have data around, and this will be maybe of interest to some of you enjoyed presentations yesterday, time and role, time to first promotion, time spent in a particular job grade. So we're able to look for these 6 groups and be really tactile in terms of some of the actions that we're going to build. And it's all of this data and analysis that goes into shaping our strategy and our commitments. And so not just the use in HR, but delivering that data to executives, supporting the departmental leadership teams who are on the ground making the decisions that make a difference. And so I guess I would just say, the governor said it when he joined the bank, what gets measured gets done. We believe in that. So we set goals. You can see the intentionality behind some of our programs and the success that we've had because of it. And then monitoring to make sure, that you're responsive and flexible along the way.
I'm going to ask Sheila and Micheal's forgiveness and say, actually, I think we'll move to questions from the audience now, if that's okay, rather than come to you on this question. And also to flag, I'm sure if you find Meg in the coffee break and want to talk about data, then she'll be more than happy to. But I want to give you the chance to ask our panel questions now, rather than continue with the questions that we had. So, over to you if there are any questions. If there's not, I've still got some I can work through, but I'm sure you have some. Got one at the top.
I am wondering about as a leader in an organization that values diversity, equity, and inclusion, and as somebody who personally values it, I'm really worried about what is seen as a bit of a growing backlash in the public about this, and I'm getting asked questions. Even at the board and senior levels in our organization, like, what are we going to do? And people wondering out loud if we need to start being quiet about what we're doing so that we don't get attacked, particularly as public organizations, right? So I'm just wondering how you guys are thinking about this, other than being depressed by it.
Thank you. Sheila, would you like to respond to this?
Well, having worked in this field for a very long period of time, I have been on that roller coaster from the beginning when you first had the laws, and then it went through the cycle, and then it comes back around and back around. So in some regards, I think I'm in a position to address it, probably in different ways, that those who haven't been doing this work for a long time, I think they are in a position about, do we slow down or not? And definitely, the backlash is there. How it comes to you, you have to step back and say, okay, how do we deal with this? So one of the things that my colleagues in the States, that we talk about this more so than other things these days, is, how do we address it? It's not going, it's still a high priority. There's still a commitment to it. You do have to reinforce it with employees. No, we're not going to stop establishing objectives. We're not going to eliminate actions to help support. And so one of the things that I have begun to do is it seems like when you lead with the word diversity, that gets everybody up in arms in the United States. I'm not sure what's going on. I know what's going on in the rest of the world, but in the United States, when you lead with diversity, the perception there is that you're talking about giving preference. And so in order to keep this work moving toward the right direction, we're, looking at, not that we don't speak about diversity, we do, but we have to frame it so that people understand when we're talking about diversity, it's about inclusion of differences and how you bring yourself to work overall. But when you speak about it from the point of inclusion, if you are in the right lane, you understand that inclusion means that there's also exclusion. And so we take it from our conversations with inclusion, equity of application of policy, and the diversity element of making sure we're inclusive of all the differences and that we're applying our policies in the right way. So that pushback is there, and I think it's more, in the States, it's more around, are we giving preference to others and not allowing sort of the males in the organization to also be treated equitably. And the difference, and what we do try to do, is to talk about the difference between equity and equality. There is a difference between the two. And so we're having more conversations around that, but we're staying the course, and we're moving forward. And, in the D&I space, those of us who are leading that, we have to stay the course. Otherwise, when you take your foot off the gas, everything stops, and then it's hard to get started again. So we're trying to make sure that we have a level field and we keep pushing forward.
Thank you. Would you like to?
Yeah, I agree with everything Sheila said. I think it would be very hard to disagree with any of that. I think one of the things that sustains us internally, that keeps us true to that course, is living what we call our values and our behaviours. So the idea that essentially, when you boil down a lot of what we do in this world, it's about being a respectful human and actually valuing somebody else as highly as you value yourself. I think it respects the differences. So, like, if I'm ever having a bad day, which is very rare in the office, but I always think of, like, is there a person that found it easier to come into the organisation today because they felt more included and they didn't feel they had to hide some part of themselves? And I think to overcome some of that backlash then that comes from the question, it's explaining that. I think there's a real, unless you're in those shoes, there is a real lack of understanding or awareness of what that feels like. And I think explaining that purpose and the why and the outcome, and that it's not a one in, one out, it's an expansion of what inclusion means to everyone, is really important. But it's the lived behaviours and the values that really actually sustain us. And if we need to bring someone back from that backlash point, it's, well, what you're saying, where does that fit with what we stand for as an organisation? Take ED&I out of it, where does that fit? And it can be quite hard sometimes for them to argue back in that sense. But it's an education piece. I think everything we've done on our journey in the Central Bank of Ireland has been about raising that standard of understanding and awareness. And I think once you get that fundamental right, you're on a really good platform to build. But that's notwithstanding that society, in the Irish context in particular, is changing at an accelerated rate, that we're playing catch up on some of the more diverse societies out there, and that is raising different questions, absolutely. So the backlash thing is a real question in our world, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to add another angle that, so of course in agreement with all of these, but it's also our job to be able to articulate how being inclusive and equitable makes our work better, right? It makes our work better for the people we're serving. It makes our work, so there's the internal piece, right, around getting people on board with our values and what we're trying to achieve, but it's also that we are better central bankers when we have diverse people, there's space for their ideas, and our programs and policy decisions see all the people we're serving. So,
thank you. I am afraid that is all we've got time for, so we will need to wrap this panel up so you can hear from the next panel. But we will all be here at the coffee break, so please do approach us if you've got any questions. So thank you for your openness on the panel today and your insights. It's been brilliant. Thank you.